Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another of our weekly studies. And today, great opportunity to do a real quick review on some kinesiology, because I did see, I think it was Brad who posted a question. He had done one of the quiz questions, pretty straightforward, really just a terminology issue. It was asking essentially horizontal adduction, and was asking whether it was pulling, pushing, hip hinging, squatting. Again, pretty straightforward question, but affords me an opportunity to kind of review a little bit about kinesiology, because NASM will ask, occasionally they'll ask some questions that are basically definitional, meaning that if you know what the definition is and you understand basic movements, you should have no problem getting the question correct. It's not a situational question, for instance. And so in this case, if you understood, and you're not confused by horizontal adduction and abduction, you would know that the answer to this particular question, I know Brad actually picked pulling. And the funny thing is that he actually knew what the answer was. It was just the terms. Remember, in kinesiology, terminology is very important. There are certain terms that are kinesiological in academia and in practice. And then there are some terms that are just sort of colloquial terms that we use in the real world. And in the case of this question, if you look at it, it's in the NASM, obviously it's in this private group. You'll notice that the terminology, the kinesiological terminology, is horizontal adduction and abduction. Now I'm going to go over it with you and kind of explain it. Again, pretty straightforward. I know for most folks that the issue is not just the terminology, but it's actually trying to discern or equate the terms that are used, such as horizontal abduction, flexion, extension, with real world movement. And then on top of that, with muscle action. And we're not going to get into that part of it. Again, I just want to do a quick review on the shoulder itself, specifically within the context of horizontal adduction and abduction. It's normally not one of the planar movement patterns that is spoken about a whole lot, although it should be, because it's used in, or at least it's a movement pattern that we see during some of the most basic movements, such as bench presses, dumbbell presses, any type of rowing movement where the elbows are up and out to the side. So that's why I want to go over it with you. And again, like I say, Brad, who actually posted this, was confused, not because he didn't understand what horizontal adduction and abduction is, because he actually knew, because his post basically said, this is right, pulling it to the midline of the body. The reason I'm going over this is because it was the term pull, pulling and pushing. Those are not kinesiological terms. Those are real world terms that we use. And I just want to make sure that we clarify the kinesiological terminology: abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, protraction, retraction. Those are all kinesiological terms, and they occur at joints or body segments, versus what we use when we talk about exercises, which is pushing movements, pulling movements, lateral raises, right? Anything like that, pressing movements. Those terms correspond, or at least describe, movements that we then will describe within the context of kinesiological terminology, right? So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. And the first thing we have to do is just kind of understand what horizontal adduction and abduction is. Don't let the terms confuse you, because the sort of the common terminology, horizontal adduction and abduction, can be called other things, okay? And depending on what you read or who you talk to, you might see another term called horizontal flexion and horizontal extension. Now, remember, this is NASM. NASM wants to use horizontal adduction and abduction. For instance, when I went to school, we used horizontal flexion, horizontal extension, but we don't want to get confused over the terminology. Just use horizontal adduction and abduction. And really, it's pretty straightforward. Horizontal adduction, okay, is movement And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the pen here so you can see. Horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction simply relates or are terms that are used to describe movement at the shoulder when the arms, right, are up or the shoulder is in an abducted position. Remember, this occurs in the frontal plane. Shoulder abduction, shoulder adduction. Now, remember, the shoulder can go up and down in the frontal plane, but anytime there's the transverse planar movement or rotational movement, right, in the transverse plane, you got to give it another term, and that's where this term horizontal gets thrown in. So in this case, as you can see, we're really just talking about the arm moving from, let me go ahead and do this again for you, in a abducted position, right? So the shoulder starts here. That's the whole point of this, is that the shoulder starts here and then moves into this position. Okay, I hope you can all see that it goes from out here and moves forward, right? Now the position is there. Okay, that makes sense. That's called horizontal adduction, because adduction, a definition of adduction is movement toward the midline of the body. So movement toward the midline of the body. And then abduction is just the opposite, movement away from the midline of the body. That's why with my hands at my side, that is what's known as an adducted, shoulder adducted position. If I lift my arm out to the side, right? So the hand, for instance, in this kinetic chain is moving away from the midline of the body. This is just convention. You got to memorize that. Okay, so abduction, adduction. But now if I'm in an abducted position, any movement in the transverse plane, right? Moving my arms to the front, moving them back, now adds this prefix word to it, so to speak, right? Horizontal, right? So now my arms are horizontal. And my hand is still out here, away from my body, away from the midline. Now it moves towards the midline. That has to be called adduction. So we just say horizontal, right? My arms are horizontal. Now they are adducted, and now they are abducted, abduction. And that's basically what this slide is showing you. So that's horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. Here is where we had a little bit of the confusion, which is if you look at the picture of these two guys right here. If he was holding on to a machine, right, a pec deck machine, and he was pulling them together, do you hear how I use the word pull? Okay. Yes. Or if I'm holding a cable, I can pull my arms. And that's what Brad actually said in his post. So he understood, right, that it's toward the midline of the body, right? He understood that. What NASM did is they kind of confused you with the terms pull and push. The understanding, or at least the generally accepted terminology, is that anything that moves forward anteriorly is pushing, and back posteriorly is pulling. So yes, even though I am pulling the cable closer to the midline of the body, technically, right, this is where it can be a little bit confusing. Technically, that's not really correct. We would say pushing forward. And by the way, I'm not saying it's a well-worded question. You can see that what Brad brought up was a very good point, in that depending on whether you're doing a bench press where you're pushing the weight away, or correctly, like he said, pulling toward the midline of the body. I mean, that is the terminology. I would actually say the same thing. I would not say I'm pulling a bench, pulling a bar away from me. No, I would say pushing. However, if I'm doing a pec deck machine, or I've got cables and I'm doing a cable crossover, well, technically I am pulling it across the midline to the midline of the body. So I get it. That's why I wanted to make sure we understood that what we're talking about, at least what NASM is talking about, is basically pushing movements like the bench press. Once again, let me go ahead and show you the goal here. Now, remember the previous slide. Now, if you think back, See the movement. The movement is at the shoulder. Okay. And this is one of the things about from a kinesiological perspective, you always got to be careful with. Always remember kinesiology, when we talk about terminology within a kinesiological context, we're always talking about the joint. The fact of the matter is that out at the end of the kinetic chain is my hand. So if my hand is moving like this, yes, I can use that as a reference, but technically it's the shoulder. So don't worry about the hand so much, but be more concerned with what's happening at the shoulder. So if the shoulder itself is moving in the transverse plane across to the midline of the body, then technically it's horizontal adduction, right? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't matter that the elbow is moving simultaneously. We're more focused on the shoulder joint, and that's why I'm pointing it to you. So the shoulder joint. Now watch, when we go into the bench press, it's the same thing. You'll notice that, and I'm just circling the shoulder joint, but you'll notice that even in this supine position, technically the arms are up. I'm just lying back in a bench press and my elbows are flexed. But the joint positioning is exactly the same as what I just showed you in that previous slide. And then, of course, if you look, it's obvious that as the shoulder goes through this forward movement, it's bringing the limb or the hand, again, you're going to use that as your reference, towards the midline of the body. So technically, the hand, right, the hand which is simply moving up is bringing the upper arm closer to the midline of the body. Trust me when I say this can be some of the most confusing. It's very simple from a technical standpoint. It really is very simple, but it can be very confusing simply because of the terminology. Now, obviously, if I was to say to somebody, is this a pushing or a pulling movement? What would you say? It's a pushing movement. And that's why the answer to that particular quiz question was pushing. So horizontal adduction is generally associated with pushing. However, the question, to be more precise, would have included something related to elbow flexion and extension. So simultaneously, because that would involve the pushing component and working of the pectoralis major, just as a for instance in this particular example. So again, let me go back. Remember, the goal here is to understand that shoulder horizontal adduction is simply taking the hands from, you're in a cross position, or now remember, this position at the shoulder is the same, the shoulder joint here and the shoulder joint here in the same position. The only difference is the placement of the hand or the relative flexion and extension at the elbow. That's why it looks like I'm pulling versus pushing. Once again, I'm going to agree with you, Brad, that, yeah, I could definitely understand why you could say pulling. However, we do understand that this concept of pushing is more in line with the terminology or understanding of horizontal adduction. Pushing, pulling movements are by convention going to be defined like NASM does with pushing anterior forward movement, and that would include technically it would include anything that the pectoralis major does, whether it's with a fixed elbow position or a mobile elbow positioning scenario like in a bench press. I hope that does not create more confusion. The idea is to actually help you to understand, so that when a question like that does pop up, because what would be the other question that you would see that NASM very easily could ask, and I think I might have seen it, instead of horizontal adduction, right? Horizontal abduction would be associated with what type of movement? Well, it would be pulling movement, right? It would be pulling, like your rear deltoid trapezius, your lats, obviously. So keep that in mind, that from NASM's perspective, because this is a sort of an aberration from an exercise perspective terminology, pushing movements is going to involve shoulder adduction. Pulling movements are going to involve shoulder abduction. Again, just wanted to do a quick review on this. If you have any questions, obviously we want you to continue, and I appreciate Brad actually putting that in the posting. It was again, I know there's lots of folks that are looking at that and going, yeah, I'm kind of confused as well. Remember, anytime you put a question like that into the private NASM group, you're actually helping a lot of folks, not just yourself. So please go ahead, throw them in there, because that's what we look at to answer some of these questions. If you have anything specific you want a weekly study to be done on, just post it in the group and we are here to help you out. So y'all have a great weekend and we will see you next week.